You're listening to the Fezcast, produced on behalf of the Saracens Supporters Association and featuring the independent thoughts, rants and rambles of Saracens fans and special guests. If you'd like your opinion to be heard on the show, you can find the Fezcast on Facebook or Fezcast_SSA on Instagram and whatever Twitter is known as these days. But for now, enjoy this week's show.
You're listening to the Fezcast.
Well, hello everybody and welcome to another edition of the Fezcast. And joining me for this edition, we got Matt in the hot seat, who's fresh off his first day at work, and also first time this season, I think, Joe Peake's joining us. So hello to you both. How are you both?
Hey Jez, all good, thank you, mate.
Yeah, all good, mate. All good. As you can tell, I normally don't work on a Monday, so I've normally got things all planned. But today I've got the washing machine in the background of this show. So,
well, yeah. You know, keeps it real, doesn't it, Matt? Keeps it real.
Anyway, so I've got mute for a bit.
Indeed. Well, we got a good show again, as ever. We always, we do ourselves down sometimes, but I think we got a good show. We are going to be the bread of a sandwich, with the filling being an interview that I've done with ITV and TNT Sports lead rugby commentator Nick Mullins, who has been absolutely brilliant over the last few weeks. He donated something for me to sell for my Motor Neurone charity, which made 425 quid in the end, which is fantastic. And I thought I'd get cheeky and ask him whether he wanted to come on the Fezcast. So I've chatted to him about his life in rugby and his thoughts about Saracens and everything, which we will discuss the Saracens men's game in the third part of the show after Nick's interview. But first up, I mean, the big news, the big thing is England women on the weekends, inaugural champions of the new competition, with the cherry on the icing on top of a really nice cake being Marlie Packer, at long last getting the deserved accolade of World Player of the Year. Fantastic, Joe, wasn't it?
Oh, well, I think, they've righted a few demons from the Rugby World Cup. Clearly, they would have liked to have had that one in the bag as well. But, really dominant performance against the New Zealand girls, who obviously will be disappointed to be beaten in their backyard. But, yeah, really, really good performance from the Red Roses. And obviously, we had quite a few members of the Sarries team represented across the whole of WXV tournament. So with Scotland winning WXV2 and the Irish winning WX3 as well. So pretty good from the home nations, all in all, I reckon.
Yeah, I mean, slight disappointment, I think, for Wales going down to the Wallaroos with them down to 14 players. A bit of a disappointment there, but I mean, Georgia on our side, she had a great tournament as well, didn't she? So, yeah, there was some really, really good performances. But yeah, Matt, what can we say about Marlie Packer other than well-deserved of being World's Women's Player of the Year? I think I read an interview with her where she was really upset that she didn't even get nominated the previous year, and it was a fire inside her, although she was very keen to pay tribute to the team, but there was a definite fire there, and that was as much unfinished business as the World Cup final was, Matt.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've talked to her on the show before, haven't we? And I think both of us were sort of almost in awe of how driven she is, while also being a very nice person, even though on the pitch she looks like the last person you want to annoy. But yeah, quite rightly getting that World Player of the Year award. And I mean this in the nicest possible way. It almost feels boring talking about her, because you're just constantly saying she's just this machine that just keeps going and going and going. The standard never drops. It is the same every match. And yeah, it's totally well deserved. She's been the most consistent player across the calendar year by a country mile, I think. So totally well deserved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the other thing that came out of her interview, Joe, that I saw was that she was very humble in saying that, she's got 99 caps now, isn't it? So she's going to become a centurion. But there's no guarantee in her mind that she'll be in that place. And there is a new coach coming in, John Mitchell. So it'll be interesting to see where, what his thoughts are and everything. But she's making herself pretty undroppable, I think, Joe.
Oh gosh, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I mean, she's probably first name on a team sheet. I would think anywhere that she went, I think she would just. She's done really, really well since she's been captain, and I think since becoming captain both of the England team and co-captain with Saracens as well, I think it's really focused her. Over the last couple of years, you've just seen, if it was even possible, another step up from Marlie. Yeah. And I think that, she'll undoubtedly get her 100th cap, Women's Six Nations with a bit of luck in the new year. And it'll be well deserved, along with all of her other accolades that she's had over recent times. But you're right, certainly someone that you'd want in your team, you'd want as your captain, and I think she's just got that respect of all of the players. It's probably calmed her down a little bit being the captain now. She isn't quite as vocal, shall we say, in the wrong way than she perhaps used to be. And maybe that comes with a little bit of experience and growing up a bit as well, becoming a mum and such like. So, you've seen Marlie over the years, and she's at her best now, pushing into her, mid to late 30s. So not a lot you can say about that apart from just a legend.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, mid to late 30s, I long to be that young again, Joe, but I mean, there we go. Does lead me on, though, to a couple of whinges I've got to have. And I mean, I know sometimes I do come over as a bit of a grumpy old bugger at times, but a couple of things that have come to light this week that I just don't think that women's sport is being given the proper respect it deserves. Now, number one, to watch the women's game, you had to go on the ITVX, which not everybody's got. That was a big game. There was no reason why that couldn't have been on proper ITV1 or ITV2, something that would have been easier to find. Then number two, England rugby are shooting themselves in the foot. Now, a friend of mine, Colin Smith, very good friend of mine, up in Halifax, he messaged me the other day to say he'd taken his 6-year-old granddaughter along to rugby training. His granddaughter loves rugby, loves playing rugby. All his kids play. I mean, he's a rugby league man more than a rugby union, but he loves his rugby union. He follows Sale for whatever reason. But he went along to his local club where his granddaughter plays, and outside the club there's an England rugby banner, and it said on it, "Get the boys back together and get back into rugby." And I'm just sat there thinking, why is it? Are we still, gender specific and totally ignoring the women on the side of it? And then, the other thing is, I was watching the Man City Arsenal Women's Super League game, and Gareth Taylor, the Man City coach, was being interviewed, and he was describing his players as girls. And they're players. It doesn't matter. Their sex is irrelevant. And, to use a phrase like that, I just found it very disrespectful, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say who actually said this, but it did make me laugh. Asking whether the RFU's EDI rep is actually Bernard Manning was the quote I got from that, which is probably fair enough for some of what they put out. It's just the basics, isn't it? It's the trouble we've got. I mean, we've spoken about it off air before, but so many times you sort of see about, we've discussed about Rocky Clark, Sarah Hunter having more caps than Ben Youngs, and just the simple matter of adding men or women in front of records when it's appropriate to do so. And you get both sides of an argument whinging and moaning that they shouldn't do it at all, that they should do it all the time. But it's really just the basics, just to look at, everyone's playing. We want everyone to be playing the game. So, there's not even any need to have the boys in that sentence, is there? There's so many other ways of wording that and just getting people playing the game. It's frustrating that it's the basic stuff that goes missing constantly, and it's just a battle that's not being won. I don't really get it, to be honest.
I just find it infuriating that people think they're doing a good job. quite honestly, I do believe that the person who put that banner out, or when Bill Beaumont talks about what they're doing with World Rugby and everything like that, and whoever it may be, they think they're doing a good job, and they're not. They're just not thinking, I don't think, half the time. And, if people like us can see it, surely somebody who's being paid 650 grand a year like Bill Sweeney can see it, can't they, Joe?
Well, you would think so. And I think that probably is the level of frustration that is probably seen across social media, particularly now. You know that somebody is responsible for the language, and language is important. And we're not saying that everyone's going to get it 100% right 100% of the time, because people are human. But basic errors are just frustrating. I noticed that the Rugby Saracens account published something, and speaking of our new esteemed Women's Rugby Player of the Year, put in the rugby paper that her club was Gloucester Hartpury. Now, just think about how that looks when you can't get that right from something that should have been checked by the editor, checked by the writer, checked by numerous people before that is published. And you just think, come on, it's a bit silly, isn't it? And you can argue that some of these mistakes are just silly little errors. But when they continue to happen and language continues to be inaccurate, I think that's where, people start to get really frustrated, that it always seems to be happening. And in today's society, it shouldn't, and we should be doing a little bit better about it, I think. Consistency and consistent use of proper language is important.
I just think it is. It's the people at the top who should know better. Like, if we make a mistake on here, I'd be mortified, absolutely mortified. And we're just amateur people giving up an hour or two every week to put this out because we love rugby and we love our club. But as I say, if we made a mistake like that, and it will happen, as you say, Joe, we're all human, but I would be mortified by it. But I'm not being paid to do this. Whereas people who write for the rugby paper, well, it's like World Rugby, you get people, Squid Rugby's put out a fantastic review of the World Cup final, and World Rugby took it down because it's copyright. I mean, who's trying to sell this bloody game to the people out there? It really is, it's simple. It's not making the right decisions, and it annoys me. But I think we need to move on. And I think, I will have asked these questions of Nick Mullins as well, someone in the media, and see where he thinks. So shall we have that interview now, and then we'll come back and discuss the other games on the weekend that involved the Men in Black.
You're listening to the Fezcast.
Hi, Alex Osterbury here, Director of Rugby for Saracens Women. You're listening to the Saracens Fezcast.
This is the Fezcast.
Well, welcome to part 2 of the Fezcast, and welcome to our very special guest who's joined us. I've been a bit cheeky, to be perfectly honest with you, because a few weeks ago I saw the ITV rugby and now obviously TNT sports rugby commentator Nick Mullins had posted about his commentary notes, and I cheekily asked him whether he'd let me have a set of commentary notes to sell for my motor neurone disease association charity, which he kindly did. Made £425. But yeah, Nick Mullins, the voice of rugby union now, I think that's fair to say, is joining us. How are you, Nick?
I'm all right, Jez, thank you. Yeah, did you get any cash for the scrabbly bit of paper that I sent you?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, £425 it was in the end, which was really, really good. I mean, there was a bit of a bidding war went on towards the end, and yourself retweeting, Sonia McLaughlin obviously retweeting, a few other people got a bit of traction. So all well and good. So that's taken me up near to £12,500 raised now for Motor Neurone.
Well
so
done.
Absolutely,
you're looking very trim, I have to say. What's that rugby shirt you're wearing?
This is my Abingdon Rugby Club shirt, which is a club I played for 20-odd years, coached at, played at, coached youngsters at. So, yeah, quite interesting. Wednesday night, I was on Radio Leicester with Tom Varndell. And Tom, I coached at county level many, many, many years ago. So that was just quite an interesting one. But, yeah. Nick, I mean, we could have a chat about rugby and your life in rugby and also a little bit about Saracens and everything. But, I mean, tell us, first of all, how did you get started in doing commentary? And obviously not just rugby union. I mean, you do a lot of sports. You've done Olympics, you do Wimbledon, various other things. I mean, where did it start for you and why sports commentary?
Actually, before we start properly, Jez, can I apologise? We're having a new roof put on at the moment.
Oh dear. Well, that's fair enough.
I know our spare room, which I grandly call the study, is at the front of the house, and they've just decided to take the roof off the porch. So it you wouldn't have heard much of me. So I've moved to the back of the house into our youngest daughter's bedroom, and they've just decided to take the roof off the back of the house as well. So,
I still worry about it. Matt last night when we recorded part one, he had his washing machine going as his first job. So it all adds to it. But yeah,
it's domestic bliss. How did I get into this funny world of shouting out names? My mum will say that whenever I used to play football a lot as a kid. I grew up in Leicestershire, and I'd always come home as a snotty 9-10-year-old. And the first thing I did was write a match report, which is just the saddest thing in the world, isn't it? I mean, no wonder I had no friends when I was 9 and 10 and still have no friends. It's all I've ever wanted to do, really. I love English. I love words. I love chatting. I love gossip. I love sport. I love rugby. And there's a job that allows me to do all of those things at the same time. So, I mean, I didn't set out, obviously, as no one does when you're talking to your careers advisor at high school about the jobs you want to do. I didn't say I want to be a rugby commentator for TNT and go to World Cups with ITV, but it's just how it works out. I always wanted to be a journalist, and I'm in a peculiar form of journalism, a specific form of journalism. But what I do on a Saturday, as well as shouting out names, is try to write the story before Stephen Jones does in the Sunday Times or whoever you're reading the following morning. And that's what I love about it. You know, we're enjoying the game. We're having fun with it. We're trying to explain and, you know, sitting next to people like David Flatman last Saturday, hopefully educating on the whys and wherefores of front rows. But at the same time, I'm writing stories and I'm helping to write it's real live journalism in an area that doesn't matter because it's only sport. So we're having fun, but I'm pretending that I'm a proper journalist with a job on Fleet Street, which is what I always dreamt of.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the interesting thing then is I'm going to take you back to when you were young and obviously beginning to watch sport and the such like. And I mean, I mentioned now you're the voice of rugby. I mean, you're following in a great tradition. And I mean, I'm old enough to remember Bill McLaren, a bit of Cliff Morgan, maybe Eddie Butler as well, you know, sadly passed recently. You've carrying on that mantle of describing the game in such a beautiful way that I think it's very easy just to say that a commentator is there just bringing you what's going on, but you're adding to the entertainment of the game, aren't you? And those people I mentioned certainly did, and you do yourself.
Well, it's a lovely thing to say, Jez, and I try to be good company, and I try to imagine, you know, you guys sitting next to us in the commentary box, or you know, my friends, or my mum, who's you know my biggest fan and my biggest critic as well. We just try to be good company, and we try not to talk too much, which is important on television. You know, we try not to be those people in the stands that you find yourself plonked next to and think, oh, really, will you just shut up? Can I find another seat? The other thing I would say, and I feel quite strongly about this, I'm not the voice of rugby in the way that Bill, who always has been and remains my broadcasting commentary hero, Bill McLaren. Bill was the voice of rugby because, you know, with the greatest of respect to Nigel Starmer-Smith, who I became great mates with when I was working on BBC Radio, Bill was the voice of rugby because there really was only one voice of rugby. I think what's brilliant about where we all are now as fans first and foremost, but you know, from our point of view as broadcasters, is that there are loads of us. And you know, I love listening to Ali Eakin, who I work with on TNT Sport. I love I loved working with Miles Harrison for ITV out at the World Cup. I love listening to Andrew Cotter and Mark Robson when he's working in Northern Ireland. There are I don't know what, dozens of us probably around the world. It's lovely that you describe me as the way you do, but I'm really uncomfortable with that because I'm just one of many voices of rugby who hopefully all of us love the game. I'm sure of that, and we just want to sell a game that doesn't have to go far to look for its problems at the moment, does it? And that's how I feel about it. And I'm always trying to be positive, and I want you at home, if you're not lucky enough to be at the match, to enjoy what we're enjoying. And I think that's our job right now more than ever, is to be positive about a sport that needs all the mates that it can find.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that brings me on to my next question then, talking about language in sport and also the wider aspects of how the game is perceived, how the game is promoted. And we've seen a lot this week with in recent times with the World Cup and what the legacy of the World Cup's going to be. And it's great just to have seen before we come on to do this interview that England A are going to be playing Portugal at Welford Road, which has just been announced, which is absolutely fantastic. Growing that tier 2, I hate saying tier 2 because it's growing the game throughout the world. But language in sport is very important, isn't it? And I mean, and also how social media gets involved. And I think it was you who brought up the line. I'm sure it was you, and apologies if it wasn't, but I thought it was fantastic, given the fact that the Oppenheimer movie came out recently, when you described a tackle by Manu Tuilagi as destroyer of the world. And I thought that was absolutely fantastic. I thought, yeah, that was a big hit. You could have used that with Evan Estebev with his big hit in the World Cup final or whatever. Yeah. But other people got a bit snippy about it. And I'm just sort of thinking, why criticise what, I mean, it's off the cuff. And I mean, you've had your controversies in the past. Was it the Fiji comment that you got pulled up on a few years ago at a World Cup about the air conditioning? But you're just trying to bring colour to it, aren't you? And, if you get it wrong, you get it wrong. But sometimes people get a bit too serious about it, don't they?
Well, what you have to be as a broadcaster, particularly a broadcaster in live sport, is yourself. You don't have time to prepare lines. You see stuff and you react to stuff that maybe in hindsight you would have done differently. But you're never, and here's the other thing, when you're going into, we had 9 million people watching England, South Africa on ITV a couple of Saturday nights ago in the semi-final. You're not going to please everybody. If you and I walk into a pub tonight and we sit down and start to chat to everybody, not everybody will like us. Not everybody will love us as much as our parents love us, or that stuff that you say won't always be universally popular. Actually, on that Fiji thing, because it's the kind of this is my Back to the Future, Marty McFly, don't call me chicken thing. The only mistake I made on that Fiji thing was not to attribute it, because it actually wasn't my description of what was happening back in Fiji on the night that England played them in that opening match in 2015. It was actually as a result of a question of mine. This is really boring, but you've opened a can of worms here, Jez. The Fiji coach, some of you may remember back then, was a guy called John McKee. And I said, just paint us a picture, John, of what's going to be happening back in Fiji Saturday morning as it would have been in Fiji time. And he said, well, those of you who've been will know that in the big cities will just close down. Everybody will be watching television. But on the islands that dot around the Pacific that form Fiji, there will be people trying to find a decent satellite signal, going to the top of hills, gathering around that one television set. And this is the truth, because I spoke to a number of people about it afterwards, hoping that the electricity doesn't fail. And that's the Fiji coach saying that before the game. But that's the challenge of live broadcasting to millions of people, that there will be one or two who took offence at that, and took offence fairly majorly, without understanding the context. I don't know whether they'd have taken the offence that they took if they'd have known that it was actually the Fiji coach who was describing what was going on back in Fiji at that point. But there are people, it's the nature of Twitter, sadly, it's the nature of where we are at the moment socially, that people like to go looking for fights. They like to be offended by stuff, but not everybody understands what it is they're being offended by and where it comes from.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we will have great sympathy with your comment about Fiji. We interviewed Simon Rawalui a couple of seasons ago in the immediate aftermath of the cyclone in Fiji from his house in Fiji, and the internet was somewhat unstable. But yeah, it does bring me on though, talking about to the Rugby World Cup, which you've just come back from. You had the great responsibility of calling the final, which, me personally, I got in a little bit of trouble on social media for pointing out that I didn't think it was the greatest final, in common with an awful lot of finals, because there's so much at stake that actually, New Zealand couldn't put three faces together at one point, and South Africa kind of got their 12 points and sat back looking for drop goals. And to say for the purists, I described it as a game that I would have loved playing in, being a hairy backside back row forwards. Yeah, I'd have loved playing in that game. But if you were the casual viewer who perhaps has come into the game, and for argument's sake, my wife, she sort of went, well, okay, I'm not really enjoying this, and moved off and did something else, whereas I was watching it. For you to call a game like that, I mean, is it difficult to call a game when perhaps, you're wary that a lot of the people watching perhaps are watching for the first time, or are watching our irregular viewers, shall we say?
Yeah, I'd actually, to begin with, I disagree with you on the final, and I think without pointing the finger at you, Jez, you are not responsible for this, shall I say? But I don't know many other sports followers who criticise their game as much as we do in rugby. How many brilliant? Actually, the Football World Cup final last time out was a brilliant match. So that's a rubbish comparison. But very often we know, because we've followed sport all our lives, that these finals don't live. They very often aren't the best in terms of their technical quality, the best games that we've seen all season. But I defy anyone to say that the World Cup final a couple of Saturdays ago didn't have the most amazing storylines. It didn't have characters in it that you were captivated by. It didn't have theatre. It didn't have the noise that you'd expect from a World Cup final, and the sights and the sounds. And I think sometimes we as rugby supporters get het up over line-out moves that don't work, or scrums that fall to the ground, or passes that don't necessarily go to hand, particularly in those conditions. And I think part of the job for us as commentators on nights like that is to tell the stories, to remind people of the stories of Sia Khaleesi, of Aaron Smith, whose life has been defined by this sport, whose dad, who drove him into the sport, had died earlier in the year, of Eben Etzebeth's dad, Harry, who died the week before he captained the Springboks in Auckland in July. These are the stories. These are life stories, Jez, that people, prime time, Saturday night, want to know about. We might be concerned about whether the middle pod at the line-out's being marked, but generally my next door neighbours have no idea what I'm talking about if I go to that level of detail. They just want to be entertained for a couple of hours. And I think the 2 hours that we put out on ITV1, with the help of those two teams and the stories that they wrote, could it have been more dramatic in rugby terms? We know it could have been. But was it a compelling 2 hours? I genuinely think, for those who perhaps don't think about it as much as we do, it was. And that's where I go back to our responsibility to the audience, but also importantly to the sport. One of the things that I learned, and I learned a million things off Bill McLaren and Cliff Morgan and David Parry-Jones, all these brilliant broadcasters, Starmers, Jim Neely in Belfast. One of the things I learned was that it's too easy to criticise. Celebrate the sport. Look for the good things. Bill would criticise, but let's not turn this into a social media moan fest. Work out what the stories are, emphasise those stories, make sure that those who don't know what Sia Khaleesi's story is know it, before the match and in the early stages of the match, so they can cotton on to that and bring the personalities in, bring the characters in. We get criticised sometimes. One of the more regular criticisms of us as commentators is that we overdo the backstories. But I think the stories, when you're talking to 9 million people, are the things that bring 9 million people in. You know, they don't want to look at 30 anonymous players in green shirts and black shirts on a pitch. Each one of those players, as we all know, playing for the clubs that we used to play for, have their own stories. And those stories mean that we care about what they do. So our job that Saturday, for those who weren't South African or New Zealand, is to say, here are the stories, you pick your team, this is what matters, and we're going to have fun because it's the biggest night of rugby in 4 years, and let's sit back and enjoy it. That's the job of the commentator. So I've got to be there, I've got to sell it, I've got to know what the story is, but essentially it's about having fun, I think. And if I'm oversimplifying it, then get somebody else to do the job. But I think if you're not having fun with sport on the night of a World Cup final, you're really in the wrong place.
Well, absolutely. It is just a game, isn't it, at the end of the day? And I mean, admittedly, with great prizes and these days, a lot of money involved in it. The question I have to ask is, from your viewpoint, the World Cup, what is the legacy of this World Cup going to be? Obviously, you know, South Africa, I mean, their legacy, we've seen it all over now, them going into the townships and whatever, and all of this going on. But is the game ripe for growth? Is the game right to go to the next level on the back of this World Cup? And are we making the right decisions? I mean, I know you as a commentator, you've got to remain pretty neutral, pretty unbiased when you're calling the game, and you do that brilliantly. But you look at the game, you love the game. I mean, what do you think should be coming out of this World Cup now?
Well, I wouldn't worry about growing the game at the moment. I mean, I'm just speaking very personally here. I wouldn't worry about growing the game right now. I would. My main concern is protecting it, to make sure that the game we have right now this week isn't any less of a game if we came back to do this conversation in 12 months' time. Because 12 months ago, if somebody had said we'd be having a premiership that had lost 3 of its biggest teams, we'd be appalled by that prospect. If we were told that within the next 12 months, we'd be losing one of the championship's best teams in Jersey, we'd be appalled by that prospect. So, to be honest, Jez, it's not a lack of ambition here from me. It's just I don't want it to be any more diminished than it is right now. So let's look at what we already have and strengthen that. So cement the support that we give to Portugal, to Fiji, to Samoa, to Chile. I spent 2 days with Chile ahead of their game with England up in northern France during the World Cup. And it's like traveling back in time. It's like traveling back 25, 30 years to the days of proper amateurism, people who play this because they absolutely love it. The essential goodness of this sport, if this isn't getting too ridiculous, is still in place. Because I travel around the clubs, I spend days at Old Albanians watching Saracens train. I go all over the world talking to rugby folk, watching rugby folk. The essential goodness of the sport is still there, but goodness me, it needs protecting at the moment. So before we get too ambitious about growing the sport, I'd make sure that we safeguard what we already have. So yeah, will the sport be any bigger in 4 years' time? I really don't care, to be honest. I don't want it to be any smaller.
Well, that's a really good, valid point, and it does bring me on now to domestic rugby. And then you were at Stonex, so from Stade de France one weekend to Stonex the following weekend to see
Stade de France to a proper stadium.
Well, I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? I mean, not only is it all about what's going on the playing field, but it's also about what goes on outside of the game. And I mean, Saracens are a club who've come in for a lot of criticism. Many people say quite rightly so. Recent history is something that we would rather move on from, but we know we can't because it will always be chucked at us. And it's daft really because it's normally chucked at us, the fans, because we're the ones who are on the social media or at the forefront of it. But Saracens really in common with a lot of clubs who are successful. I mean, you know, if you're Leicester or you're Gloucester or Bath or Bristol, you've got pretty much a rugby crowd there ready. Clubs like Saracens, where they're competing against Arsenal and Tottenham and West Ham in the football, and there's Harlequins just down the road. There was London Irish just down the road. You got, you know, whatever. Are they doing the right things off the field as much as they are obviously doing the right things on the field to try and consolidate what they offer to people who want to come and watch rugby union?
I don't know a bunch, and this applies to the backroom staff at every single Premiership club. I don't know a bunch of people who work harder than those who work at Premiership rugby clubs right now to keep them afloat. And I speak as somebody whose wife used to be head of comms at Wasps, and she was in charge of the communications as they were making the move up from Wickham to Coventry. These people are absolutely devoted, and we know, and you know, because you go to the Stonex and you know Saracens inside out. So with as a bunch now, all of us involved in this chat, all of you listening know that those at Saracens, from Lucy Ray downwards, and the foundations that the brilliant Nigel put in place are there to provide something that's sustainable. And it's competitive. Crikey, it's competitive. You know, for all the reasons that you said. But just think where your club has come from over the last 20 years, because I won't be the only one who remembers going to Bramley Road and thinking, crikey, where's the stadium? And then realizing that I was already at it. And I was actually thinking ahead of this chat, Jazz, about the first time I commentated on a Saracens game on the telly, and I found my original commentary sheet, and I'm going to have a little quiz with you here, because it was the first ever. It was a Heineken Cup match. We were doing it on the BBC back then before we lost it to Sky. It was November 1999. And I'm sure that a lot of you listening to this now may well have been here. It was the first ever game in Europe between Saracens and Munster. And it was Vicarage Road, in the days of Vicarage Road. It was a pool game in the Heineken Cup. Munster won it 35-34. Okay. And it remains one of the... you know, we do a million games a season, so there are lots of them I don't remember, to be absolutely honest. But I've always remembered this game because it felt special, because it was Saracens. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds while I ramble on here to try and think of as much. Can I put you on the spot here?
You can do, yes.
How many do you reckon you'll be able to remember? This is impossible for you, Jez, and this is so unfair, and feel free to edit this out if you want to. But I wonder how many of that Saracen starting 15 who played against Munster that day in November, whatever it was, November 24 years ago.
Well, I'm going to go. I would imagine probably was Matt Cairns the starting hooker.
Matt Cairns was not the starting hooker, no.
Oh, he wasn't. So, I mean, Tim Horan would have been at the club.
It was the replacement. Matt Cairns, according to my commentary notes, was a 20-year-old from Birkenhead.
Right.
So,
right.
The starting hooker was only 23. George Shooter.
Shooter, of course, yeah, fabulous George Shooter, who obviously went then on to Tigers, and a great player, I think, and perhaps deserved a bit more international recognition. But I mean, at a time then, you know, there was a lot of good hookers around, wasn't there? But
yeah, I'll give you the front row. It was Roberto Grau, do you remember the Argentinian?
Yeah.
Shooter, and a tight head who went on to win things with Leicester as well.
Julian White.
There you go.
Yeah, so
there you go.
Richard Hill would have been playing, the greatest of all time.
Name your back row. So Hill 6, one of the most famous players in the world at the time, was 7.
Would have been Francois Pienaar.
There you go.
And was Tony Dipro still at the club then?
I'm impressed with this. This is good, yeah.
Yeah. So second row...
That wasn't a bad row, was it? Hill, Pienaar, Dipro's, crikey.
Oh, yeah, hell of a back row. And I mean, second row, Paddy Johns, was he still around?
He may well have been. He wasn't playing in this match. It was Scott Murray.
Oh, yeah.
He was absolute Scotland superstar at the time, and Danny Grucock.
Oh, the walking red card. Halfbacks would have been, I presume, Kieran Bracken, and was Michael Liner still at the club, or had he left?
It was Nick. It was Nick Walsh. Kieran was unfit according to my commentary notes that day. Nick Walsh was 9, and a Frenchman who scored
Thierry Lacroix.
Thierry Lacroix.
Yeah.
10.
Centres was Tim Horan.
No, Kevin Sorrell, Jeremy Thompson.
Oh, blimey! Yeah.
You might get the wingers, Ryan Constable and Rob Thirlby.
Yeah, oh blimey, Rob Thirlby. There's a name from there. Yeah, blast the past. The fullback would have been. Again, Gavin had moved on by then, hadn't he?
Well, I said on my commentary notes, if it's a clue, you'll know the name. Huge name, but he was happier maybe as a fly half. I kind of think of him as a fly half more than where he was playing for Sarries that day. Former Gloucester fly half, won some England caps. Mark
Mapletoft.
There you go.
Good.
I'll mention one bloke on the bench because we always like to take the mickey out of him. Prop replacement, one of them. Actually, the 2 prop replacements. Paul Wallace. Crikey, it was a good team, this, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Another prop replacement was a 19-year-old who still had hair back then, David Flatman. Whatever happened to him?
Wow, indeed.
Whatever happened to him? It says here. It says here. I predicted a big future. I was wrong. Made nothing of his life.
Absolutely not. Well, what fantastic memories those are. But let's come up to date now. And as I say, you've been done the commentary on the Saracens Leicester game. I mean, Saracens brought back all their internationals. We discussed that in part 3. We think they were always going to do that with a truncated season. I think, you've lost 2 games already at the start of the season. That's over 10% of your games lost. They were always going to bring back the big names, particularly in a home match against Leicester. You've got to sell out those home matches.
Do you know how that worked, though, Jez? Do you know how that works? That actually wasn't Mark McCall's decision. That wasn't the coach's decision. That was the players' decision.
Yeah.
Because Mark had been speaking with them as England were making their way to the semi-final, and the coaches and the players, it won't surprise you to know, are in touch with each other on a daily basis, pretty much, even when they're away from home. Mark was saying, listen, at some point over the next 4 or 5 weeks, we're all going to have to take a week off here and there. You tell me when you would like your week off, and we'll work our team around it. And every single one of those England players said, hang on, Leicester at home, first game we're back, I'll be there for that. So that wasn't a Mark McCall decision. That was the players, all of those players who played so brilliantly last weekend would just, I agree with you. I heard what you were saying on last week's podcast. How you come back, players like Owen and Marrow, how you come back and Jamie come back and play at that level a week after playing in a 3rd place playoff in Paris is just beyond me. And that's going back to a previous conversation. It's why we need to celebrate what these players are about, and let's be positive about the game. Let's not bang on about refereeing decisions. Let's talk about how extraordinary it was that Ben Earl, after the World Cup he had, should come back and play at the level he played for his club last weekend.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I'm going to put my biased Fez hat on here and say Ben Earl, for me, I picked him as my player of the tournament in the World Cup. I think he was, coming from the team he was playing for, given that an awful lot of people said that England wouldn't get out of the group stages. And then, would they get past the quarterfinals even if they did? I think Ben Earl played at an intensity for an inexperienced international player, because he is still an inexperienced international player, playing out of position effectively at number 8. I just think he had an absolutely amazing tournament. I think an awful lot. Maro Toji's back to his best, isn't he? Or very near to it. Owen Farrell, again, you play him at 10, he gives you that control, he gives you that different aspects of the game that I think are so important to England and gets England moving despite what's in front of him. And, that's not me having to go at George Ford and Marcus Smith, who I think are great players and do perform really, really well. But Owen Farrell's just leadership, determination, organisation. He's just got the whole package, hasn't he?
Yeah, he was brilliant. And I think the challenge for Steve Borthwick is to work out who his first choice 10 is. I mean, you look at George Ford and just the way he controls games as well. The way Ford played in those early matches, particularly against Argentina. George Ford, what are you doing? There were a couple of times actually, and I'm not a fan of commentators who are fans, because you're always talking to somebody who supports, either one team or the other. And genuinely, as much as I'm from Leicester, I grew up in Leicester. I grew up in Leicestershire. I grew up following Leicester Tigers. That's where my love of rugby developed. I'm not a Leicester fan. I can't be, because I know Mark McCall better than I know Dan McKellar. And I know so many of those Saracens players better than I know the Leicester players. So when people say, how can you not be biased? You come from Leicester. It's not understanding what our job's about. Our job, I'm going down to Exeter tomorrow, and I'm going to go and see Harlequins on Thursday, and I'll be with Northampton on Friday. So we're getting to know these players and the coaches, not as mates, but we get to know what they put into it. So anyone thinking, or anyone listening, I hope anybody listening back to Saracens Leicester on Saturday wouldn't have heard me and went, there's a bloke who's supporting Leicester, because it's not how it works. You have equal sympathy for both teams. You want it to be a good game of rugby and to everyone to play to their levels. But I'll let you into a little secret here. There were a couple of times during the World Cup where I almost put my England bobble hat on. And one was when George Ford was kicking the drop goals against Argentina, because I think so many of us watching that match after Curry had been sent off, thinking, particularly after the build-up to the World Cup, that Argentina were going to win this, and there was no way England were going to win this now, particularly without one of their flankers. So the way that England and George Ford played in that game in Marseille, I lost it on a couple of occasions, and I'm not proud to say that, but I did. And the other time was actually. You talk of Ben Earl. Was Ben Earl's break against Fiji in the quarterfinals, again back in the Velodrome in Marseille. And I listen back to it now and I just cringe, because he breaks through, and this is me saying what I'm thinking. And sometimes a commentator has to develop that kind of 2-second pause button that they have on the radio phone-ins, just to make sure you don't swear or say something ridiculous. And I remember Ben Earl breaking through. I don't remember what I said at the time until I listened to it back. And I said, Ben Earl, oh my God, what is he doing? And that's just me. And, there may well have been people upset with my use of words at that point, but I can't help that. That's just come from somewhere within me, watching Ben Earl do something extraordinary, running from halfway into Fiji's 22. And that's what it's about. And that's why it's always such a tricky line to tread, because you want to love the game, but you can't afford to be a fan. But just occasionally, when somebody does something who you like, who you care about, does something extraordinary, that just seeps to the surface sometimes. And I can only ask for forgiveness.
Well, I don't think you need forgiveness, because I think the one thing that I would say is that I think that if that hadn't been Ben Earl doing that, it'd have been Saya Khaleesi in the final, or it'd have been Bossia in that Fiji game, or it'd have been, Sam Cane or whatever. You'd have said exactly the same thing, because it was the right thing to say.
Well,
do that. It's just great rugby, and it deserves all the plaudits it gets.
And this is why I go back to talking about the stories of the players. We spent 48 hours with Chile in the week leading up to England playing them in Lille, so that when Chile ran out onto that pitch that weekend, I cared about them as much as I cared about England. And I promise you I did. And I was talking to people who were Chilean and happened to live in the country that we live in, but may well have been listening around the world as well. I wanted them to know that for the duration of that weekend, I knew as much about their team as I knew about England. And that's the respect I have to pay those who are spending time with us at home, and those players who devoted their life to playing for Chile in a World Cup finals. And that's what the job is. So yeah, I mean, accusations of bias are things that come with the territory, but I promise you, we work hard to make sure that we know everybody's story, and that no side matters more than the other.
Well, Nick, I have to say, I think that's as good a place as any to finish this conversation, and say thank you for giving us such a great insight into what you do. I mean, for those people who think you just rock up in front of a microphone and as you said, shout out names, it's far from that.
My dad thinks I do that. Don't worry. My dad says, "What on earth do you do during the week? Why don't you get yourself a proper job?"
Well, yeah, I mean, a proper job. I mean, I think there's an awful lot of people who would love to do the job that you do, but know that they could never do it as well as you do it. And I say thank you for joining us on the Fezcast. And as I say, we'll see you round at StoneX when you're doing your commentary jobs, and we'll say hi. And I'm sure everybody who's listening to this will find another level of admiration and respect for what you do and everybody else. And say hi to Flats from us on the Fezcast, because we tried to get him on for ages.
Oh, he's too showbiz.
He's too showbiz for us. And him and Tom Shanklin, we try to get them on, and Jim Hamilton and whatever. And they're all too big time for us. But Nick, thank you. You know, you've come on, you've been humble, you've been honest, and that's all that we ask for. And we say thank you ever so much.
A pleasure, Jez. Thanks for asking me. And also, just from my point of view, if you ever see me around at the StoneX, and if you got thoughts on TNT's coverage and what you don't like, what you'd maybe like to see more of, what you think of our coverage of Sarries, come and say hello, because that's important. We want when you settle down over the weekend to watch what we're doing on TNT to be the kind of stuff that you want to watch, and we only know that if you come and tell us. So don't be shy. Come and say hello.
Well, absolutely, and I'm sure everybody will do. But thank you very much for doing this for us, Nick. And we'll have a short break now, and then we'll come back with part 3, where we'll talk about what we've just talked about and the Saracens game against Tigers in a bit more depth.
You're listening to the Fezcast.
You're listening to the Fezcast, which is proudly sponsored by the Saracens Supporters Association. And I'm Alison Davis, one of the SSA committee. For a £10 annual subscription, the SSA provides our members with monthly newsletters, virtual and in-person player events, away match ticket allocations, and we organise pre-match gatherings at away matches. We sponsor men's and women's players, and we support the Saracens Foundation Track Club on behalf of our members. On top of all that, every year we have a seasonal SSA badge, which is exclusive to members. Where else can you get that much value for a tenner? Join now at membermojo.co.uk/SSA, or come and see us on match day in the Oasis at the StoneX.
This is the Fezcast.
Well, welcome back to part 3 of the Fezcast. And fantastic interview there, I think, with Nick Mullins. Covered a lot of ground. And actually, before we move on to the Saracens game, I do want to mention, and we talked about it, social media and also the attitude of people on social media. Wayne Barnes, the greatest referee we've seen, has retired from the game. Maybe he was going to anyway, but one of the things he cited is the fact that, he's got dog zone abuse after the World Cup final, which I felt he refereed excellently well. And it's just not right, is it, what's going on in the game of rugby at the moment, Joe?
Do you know what? I mean, anyone that takes on officiating is a much braver person than me. Everyone gets frustrated at the referees, the officials, the lines people. And again, we've just been discussing about people making silly mistakes. And people do make mistakes, but they're human. And I think, referees aren't going to get it 100% right. We've got now TMOs, and we can argue that some of those TMO decisions, particularly in the Men's World Cup, were perhaps a little bit questionable, a little bit inconsistent. Who knows? But they're only reading what they see at the time. But I agree with you, Jez. There's no excuse for some of the vitriol that is happening on social media. There'll always be trolls, and that goes for players, that goes for officials. I'd rather those people just actually keep their opinions to themselves, really, and just nobody wants to hear it. There's having a Jez rant, and then there's blatantly just attacking people, their personalities, their families. There should be no place in society for it. And, there's so much going on in the world at the moment that people should just take a little bit of a breath, I think, sometimes before they start putting out, I can't call it a tweet now, an X, whatever we're calling it now, or something on Instagram or whatever it is, direct messaging to people. And that's happening to, people in the media, that's happening to people who are officials, it's happening to players and athletes across sport. And you just think, hang on a second, it's a game that we all love and we're all passionate about supporting our team. I think sometimes we need to take stock of that the officials' role is not an easy role. They're seeing it as we all see it. And if any of us were to put on the officials' shoes and try and referee a game, we'd probably find ourselves making the same mistakes that they do. There's just no excuse, in my opinion, for some of the comments, particularly personal attacks on people. They're just not justified. And, Wayne Barnes has been a brilliant referee in his career. It's sad that he's chosen to retire for those reasons. And I think, other reasons in terms of, I think, spending time with his family will play a huge part in that as well, which, I commend him on that. He's had a brilliant career and I hope he enjoys that retirement, enjoys watching the game still. And, potentially we might even see him at a couple of games, enjoying the other side of rugby.
Indeed.
Getting out and doing some commentary from like a ref's point of view. I don't know whether you've seen it. The NFL do that, where they have old referees that come and do like some of the rules analysis and stuff like that. He'd be a great addition. Mention that to Nick Mullins, and I'll give that to him as a freebie.
Absolutely. We did hear from JP Doyle, didn't we, during the World Cup? And fair dues. I mean, the one thing to say about refereeing, number one, I think Wayne Barnes is enough of a man to accept criticism when it's given correctly. And indeed, we all are the same. We'd accept criticism on here. If someone comes on to us and says, look, I think you could do this better or you could do that, don't do that or whatever. We listen to that. We take that on board. Referees, as you say, very difficult job. I remember questioning a referee after a match a few years ago. A referee called Steve Pountney, brilliant referee. And I questioned him about a decision he made in the game. And he sat me down and he said, look, yeah, I probably could have done that one better. He said, but let me ask you a question. He says, how many times do you think I blew the whistle? Oh, 60, 70 maybe. He says, yeah, I did. Probably, between 50 and 70 times. And every time I blew that whistle is because one of the players on the pitch had made a mistake. And you're questioning my one mistake. And that's what happened in the World Cup final. New Zealand were on the back end of the refereeing decisions because they couldn't string 3 phases of play together. And they kept making mistakes. And that's just simply it. And they couldn't react to what was happening in front of them. That's why they lost. It was nothing to do with the refereeing. It was the way that they played the referee. Quite simply that. Isn't that right, Matt?
Yeah, not much more I can say there really, is there? But I mean, look, the other thing that we've got to remember is nowadays we watching at home or even in the stands sometimes have the benefit of umpteen slow motion replays, 6 different camera angles, a load of analysis after the game, and there's a bloke with a whistle out in the middle that's got to make a decision in half a second. It's not going to be right every single time, and you either have a TMO that's looking at every little angle when the game takes 4 hours to be played, or you accept that there are going to be grey areas in the game where you might think it's a yellow card, red card, penalty one way, penalty another way. It's not going to happen perfectly every single time. And yeah, social media, awful place. That's why we're on it all the time.
Well, indeed. Well, I mean, we're talking about GMO decisions and everything. Shall we move on to the big match on the weekend for the Saracens men against Leicester Tigers, and one try which was slightly dubious, shall we say. I mean, the referee said I can't see it, the linesman said I can't see it, the TMO's gone, well, he's brushed that blade of grass. Brilliant for Billy Vunipola, brilliant for Saracens. It was, I think, a performance where Saracens didn't need to get out of second gear, and for everybody from Leicester turning around and saying, do you know what, we stayed in the game, we battled hard and everything. Saracens were never in trouble, were they, Matt?
Not really, no. And it was a bit of a strange game, to be honest, because I did walk away and having a sort of chat with my dad on the way back to the car and saying, well, I think in most of the facets of the game, it was very, very even. And I sort of looked back at the stats yesterday. I know that's not the best thing to do, really, but it was, in terms of tackles, meters, carries, knock-ons, vast majority of things, it was pretty much split down the middle, that game. There were two parts of the game where it hinged on. One was that Leicester lost 4 or 5 of their line-outs because of excellence from Maro Itoje, Nick Mullins and Andy Christie as well. The scrums were a tale of two halves. In the first half, they weren't even happening because we were giving away a free kick before the ball was even going in. And then in the second half, we brought a new front row on, and all of a sudden it turned around the other way. There was the Billy Vunipola non-try. We made the most of every opportunity we had in the 22, and the only opportunities Leicester had to score were gifted to them very nicely by Owen Farrell. Quite an odd game. We didn't really have to get out of second or third gear particularly, but maybe it's the kind of game we needed to have some of those boys gel back in after us losing 2 games playing pretty badly. It was nice to win one playing pretty averagely, if that makes sense.
Well, indeed, yeah. I mean, that's the interesting thing to talk about, Joe, isn't it? The fact that Saracens made a decision to bring all their England international and other internationals back. So Ronnie Marlie came back into the squad as well. The England's contingent gelled beautifully together for a couple of tries. Maro Itoje's opener in particular, which was just, Nick Mullins, Jamie George, Elliot Daly, Owen Farrell, Maro Itoje, bish bash bosh. Thank you very much. What a beautiful try that was. And actually, it's no surprise that they gelled because they've been playing together just in a different colour shirt for the last 8 weeks. That was always going to happen. And that's the beauty of being Saracens, bringing back superstars. It's not like you're trying to fit in 2 or maybe 3 internationals. You're fitting in 7 or 8 internationals who have been away together. So that sort of morphing together is a lot easier for them. But you can understand why Saracens brought the superstars back in. As Matt said, 2 losses already in a truncated season where you don't... And when I spoke to the guys from Radio Leicester on Wednesday night and Tom Van Dalen and everything, I was at pains to say, look, you've already had 2 games is more than 10% of your total games you could win. And you've lost your first 2. You've got to then go full tap. And I think the thing is, where everybody's talking about wrestling and everything like that, I think the important thing to note is that summer 2024, I cannot see Maro Itoje, Owen Farrell, Jamie George doing anything summer 2024. England aren't going to take him on a summer tour, I don't think, because why would they use that as an opportunity to bring through some young players and turn around to these lads and say, look, you're going to have a British Lions tour next year. You have this summer off. Surely that's going to happen, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I saw the highlights. I wasn't at the game, and I agree with Matt's comments. Really, it did look like we didn't have to push things too hard. It's quite difficult to tell, obviously, on the highlight show, but some good tries, some good play, as you say. There's still some existing connections there. I definitely agree that the scrums looked shaky, shall we say, in the first half, and bringing on a new front row in the second half seemed to shore that up quite nicely. But yeah, it's a luxury that the Saracens have got in terms of bringing all those players back. They now need to build some consistency for the rest of the season, I think, and actually be able to show that they can get out of second gear. They might not have to, but why not show that they can get out of second gear and start pushing things along a little bit? That way that they're not going to just sit and relax, let teams back in, which we know has potentially been a little bit of a downfall sometimes in the past, getting ahead in some scores and then making them quite tight finishes. So, I think it's a promising third game of the season, but need to show a little bit more, I think, now going forward, and show that, the superstars are back, but actually the team can still deliver consistent performances, I think, for me.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, Joe, because there's a couple of players that I really want to highlight who I think, aren't the internationals, aren't the guys who've been away, who've been there and thereabouts, one of whom's come in for a bit of criticism this season, and we'll deal with him second. But first up, I think Nick Mullins, he's got to look at England now, and there is a massive Courtney Lawes size hole in that England team. And Courtney Lawes had a fantastic World Cup. We cannot take that away from him. But, he's going to be up against George Martin, Ollie Chesham at Tigers for that second row blindside spot for England. And the way that he played in the second row with the ability to move into the back row as needed, I think, and his line-out work, Maro Itoje and Andy Christie, again, the three of them were phenomenal. Maro, deserving man of the match. I mean, he is back to his very, very best. Whether he's playing for a new contract or improved deals or whatever, who knows? I mean, that's one of those things that sometimes happens. But Nick Mullins really stepped up and performed. But the one that I really want to mention, as I say, he's come in for a bit of criticism last season in particular. But I thought he had a really, really good game, was Aled Davies at scrum half. His supply and precision and speed of pass was back to where it was when he won our player of the season, Matt.
Yeah. I mean, he is one that does. I mean, we've talked about him ever since he joined us. Playing Championship rugby, we've been talking about him in terms of being dreadful. Our most improved player, our best player of the season. He really does seem to blow hot and cold. Against Exeter, he was absolutely appalling, hopefully by his own admission as well. I don't think he was that much better against Bath. Gloucester, his defensive work was fantastic. And then, this match against Leicester, I think you're right. His distribution and certainly the box kicking worked very, very well. He just seemed to have sped up his game a little bit. So I don't really know why that is, to be honest. It does seem very, very odd. I think potentially he's almost doing what Owen Farrell comes into criticism when he's playing for England for the way he distributes the ball, for the amount of kicking that he does. And it looks like he's playing to a plan. And I think Aled Davies is doing exactly the same thing. He's being asked to do what he's been doing by Mark McCall, and he's not necessarily executed it very well in those first couple of games. But complaining that he's box kicking so much, it's probably because he's been told to.
Absolutely. I think that's a very valid point to make. So the other point I would make in relation to Aled is the return of Ivan Van Zyl as well. That's going to put a rocket under anybody who's got that shirt. When you see the guy who was first choice and, one of not only Saracens players of the season, but I think Premiership player of the season last year, Ivan Van Zyl coming back, it's going to put pressure on you to up your game. Otherwise, you're going to lose that starting shirt, aren't you, Joe?
Yeah, for sure. I think, I've spoken about it before. I think consistency is key. But, if he delivers what the manager wants him to deliver, then we're going to end up with having a really actually good and interesting battle at scrum half. And actually, a bit of competition isn't a bad thing because it drives people to play better. I think I've seen it a lot in the women's team, particularly. We've had some new signings in the women's team. And actually that's driving players to compete, but still work as a team. But wanting to be in that starting 15, or wanting to actually, in some cases, just be in the starting 23, because it's so competitive. And that's a really good place for the club and, the directors of rugby to be in, where they've got so much talent to choose from.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. Now, the question to ask you, Matt, is now that game's gone. Looking ahead now, weekend coming up, Newcastle Falcons away. An interesting conundrum to have. I mean, is this the game where you rest a few people and say, okay, you've come back, fair dues, we'll let you have a weekend off, or are you going to go into this game at full tilt again?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any of us can pretend to know what the actual regulations from the RFU are on the England players and how much time off they're allowed to have, not allowed to have, how much game time they're allowed to have. We think we know, and it doesn't always seem to work, so that's out the window, really. Personally, yes, I would probably be resting all of them that have come back from the England side, perhaps with the exception of Theo Dan, just based on the amount of game time he had for England. Potentially Elliot Daly as well. He obviously had a bit of a break in the middle of the World Cup, but did play the latter games. But I think you've got to back the rest of the squad. We've still got plenty of international players in there. I think you have got to back them to go up to Newcastle, who are the bottom side in the league, and I don't think it's disrespectful to do so. And I think potentially as well, you've got to look at it from the club's point of view. Now, I don't think Mark McCall has necessarily been put under any pressure from this, but I'm sure there'll have been some discussion that there are only so many home games in the season, and we do need to market the club, and we do need to sell games out. So your big players play at home. And if there are some away games to drop them, and I think we're seeing that from other clubs already, that is when you do it. So yeah, I would be giving a fair few players a bit of a rest. There might be some that are on the bench. There might be some that have their feet up entirely. There might be some that go as travelling reserves. But yeah, I think it's a bit of rotation for Newcastle. But this show goes out 2 days before the squad's announced, and I'll have egg on my face probably.
Well, I've done it so, which is why I fired it over to you, Matt. The prerogative of being lead presenter. I could have thrown a hand grenade your way. I think you did pretty well there. Actually, I tend to agree with you. I think that would be the way that I would go. But as I say, in Mark McCall we trust, and we're sure whichever way we'll go, it'll go. I mean, that's the main thing. Look, I think that's as good a place as any to end this edition of the Fezcast. And say thank you, Joe. Thank you, Matt, for your time. And indeed, obviously, as well, thank you, Nick Mullins, for his time and a fantastic interview there. We're back again. What date are we back again, Matt? It's something like the 15th. Yes, well, hey, 15th of November we'll be back with another edition of the Fezcast for your enjoyment. Until then, we'll say thank you, everybody, for listening in. All the best, and ta-ra.
This is the Fezcast.